The unassuming janitor. In the fluorescent-lit halls of the Escola Galactica, the most prestigious institute of higher learning in the known universe, an unassuming figure pushed his cleaning cart, just as he did every day. Yannick, a middle-aged human with graying hair and a wiry frame, wore the gray-blue overalls of a janitor. His calloused hands, more used to grasping a mop than a pen, moved with a methodical purpose as he went about his duties. To the students and faculty who passed him in the corridors, engrossed in their own intellectual pursuits, Yannick was all but invisible, just another cog in the machine that kept the vast complex of the Escola running smoothly. It was the same role he had occupied for years, blending quietly into the background, content in his anonymity. But Yannick harbored a secret that would have shaken the Escola to its very core, had anyone bothered to look beneath his unassuming exterior. Beneath the facade of the simple cleaner lay a mind of staggering brilliance, an intellect that dwarfed even the brightest luminaries of the Escola. Yannick's IQ, a closely guarded secret, soared past 375, a figure almost incomprehensible to the average being. Yannick had learned long ago that his gift was more curse than blessing. On his homeworld, his prodigious intelligence had brought him nothing but isolation and suspicion. It set him apart, an outsider even among his own kind. In the end, hounded by those who feared what they could not understand, Yannick had fled, seeking refuge among the stars. The Escola Galactica had seemed the perfect sanctuary, a place of learning, where knowledge was prized above all else. But even here, Yannick soon discovered that his intellect was more burden than boon. He saw how the petty jealousies and inflated egos of the scholars and students alike led to endless squabbles and schisms. He understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, the dangerous attention his abilities would bring were they to be revealed. So Yannick had made a choice. He would hide his light under a bushel, don the humble garb of a janitor, and keep his genius hidden from the world. In the simplicity of manual labor, he found a strange sort of peace, a respite from the incessant churning of his own mind. As he pushed his cart down the vaulted halls of the Escola, past lecture theaters and laboratories where lesser minds grappled with concepts he had mastered as a child, Yannick allowed himself a small, secret smile. Let them have their petty triumphs and accolades, he thought. He had something far more precious, the tranquility that came with being entirely, blissfully unremarkable. Yannick turned a corner, entering a long, deserted corridor. The faint sound of raised voices caught his attention, coming from a door slightly ajar at the far end. He frowned, his curiosity piqued despite his better judgment. Approaching cautiously, he peered through the gap. Inside, he saw a group of the Escola's most eminent scholars gathered around a vast chalkboard, which was covered from top to bottom with an intricate web of equations and symbols. Even from a distance, Yannick could see that they were wrestling with a problem of immense complexity, a puzzle that had confounded the greatest minds of a dozen civilizations. As he watched, the scholars argued and gesticulated, their frustration evident. One, a tall, spindly being with pale lavender skin, threw up its hands in defeat, its voice rising in a keening wail of frustration. Yannick studied the chalkboard, his mind already racing ahead, seeing patterns and connections that the scholars, for all their vaunted intellect, were blind to. The solution was there, tantalizingly close, dancing just beyond their reach. For a moment, he was tempted to step forward, to reveal himself and put an end to their struggles. But the old habits of caution and secrecy were too deeply ingrained. With a silent shake of his head, Yannick turned away, melting back into the shadows of the corridor. It was then, as he made to push his cart onwards, that he felt it, the unmistakable prickle of eyes on the back of his neck. He spun around, his heart suddenly racing, to find himself face to face with one of the alien professors. The being was tall and gaunt, with luminous silver eyes set deep in a face the color of ashes. It regarded Yannick with a look of intense scrutiny, as if trying to peer into the very depths of his soul. "You have been watching," it said, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the corridor. Yannick swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. In all his years at the Escola, this was the first time one of the faculty had ever directly addressed him. I was just passing by, he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. I didn't mean to intrude. The alien tilted its head, a curiously bird-like gesture. No, it said softly. You are more than you appear, I think. There is something about you, something hidden. Yannick's grip tightened on the handle of his mop, his knuckles whitening. He could feel the weight of the being's gaze, the sudden, terrifying sense that his carefully maintained facade was crumbling. I'm just a cleaner, he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. I don't know anything about all this. He gestured vaguely towards the door, behind which the scholars were still arguing. The alien was silent for a long moment, still staring at Yannick with those fathomless silver eyes. Then, abruptly, it turned away. Perhaps, it said, already moving off down the corridor. Or perhaps not. We shall see, Yannick the cleaner. We shall see. Yannick watched it go, his heart still pounding. Then, with a shake of his head, he turned back to his cart, to the comforting familiarity of his mop and bucket. But even as he went through the motions of his work, his mind was racing. The alien's words echoed in his head, a warning and a challenge all at once. Deep down, Yannick knew that his days of anonymity were numbered. Sooner or later, the truth would out. The question was, what would he do when it did? For now, he pushed the thought aside, losing himself in the simple, repetitive tasks of cleaning. But he could not shake the feeling that, somewhere in the vast, star-crossed expanse of the universe, the wheels of fate were beginning to turn. And at their center, unassuming and unnoticed, was a human cleaner named Yannick, with an IQ of 375 and a secret that would change the galaxy forever. A fateful encounter. In the days following his encounter with the alien professor, Yannick could not shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted in his world. Though he went about his duties with the same diligence as always, he was acutely aware of a new scrutiny in the eyes of those around him. It was as if the alien's words had somehow marked him, setting him apart from the faceless mass of support staff. Yannick redoubled his efforts to blend in, keeping his head down and his interactions minimal. But even as he did so, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. It was as if the Escola itself had suddenly become a foreign landscape, full of hidden dangers and unknown pitfalls. His fears were realized a week later, when he was summoned to the office of the Dean of Theoretical Physics. Yannick had never been to this part of the Escola before. It was a rarefied realm, reserved for the highest echelons of academia. As he made his way through the vaulted corridors, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The dean was waiting for him in a vast, circular room dominated by a holographic star map that hung in the air like a ghostly constellation. She was a tall, imposing figure, with piercing blue eyes and a shock of silver hair that seemed to glow under the room's soft illumination. Yannick, she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. Thank you for coming. Yannick inclined his head, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Of course, Dean Vesta. How may I be of service? The dean studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. I've been hearing some interesting things about you, Yannick, she said at last. It seems you've caught the attention of some of our faculty members. Yannick swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. I'm not sure what you mean, Dean, he said carefully. I'm just a cleaner. I try not to draw attention to myself. Dean Vesta raised an eyebrow. Indeed, she said. And yet, according to Professor Zoran, you seem to have a rather unusual fascination with theoretical physics. He says he's seen you observing some of our most advanced classes. Yannick's heart sank. Professor Zoran must have been the alien who had confronted him in the corridor. I have an interest in learning, he said, choosing his words with care. But I assure you, Dean, would never presume to understand the work that goes on here. I'm just a curious observer, nothing more. The dean leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers under her chin. I see, she said. Well, Yannick, it just so happens that we have a little problem that could use a curious observer. A problem that has been puzzling our best minds for some time now. She waved a hand, and the star map vanished, replaced by a shimmering web of equations that danced and swirled in the air. Yannick's eyes widened as he took in the complex symbols and formulae, his mind already racing ahead, seeing patterns and connections that had eluded the Escola's finest. This, said the dean, is the Zendiri conjecture. A mathematical puzzle that has stumped mathematicians and physicists across the galaxy for decades. Many believe it holds the key to understanding the fundamental nature of reality itself. She fixed Yannick with a penetrating stare. Professor Zoran seems to think you might have a unique perspective on this problem, Yannick. He believes there's more to you than meets the eye. Yannick's heart was hammering now, a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through his veins. This was the moment he had dreaded and longed for in equal measure, the moment when his secret would be laid bare. He took a deep breath, his decision made. Dean Vesta, he said, his voice steady. I believe I can solve the Zendiri conjecture. The dean's eyes widened fractionally, the only outward sign of her surprise. Can you now? She said softly. Well then, Yannick the cleaner. Let's see what you can do. With a wave of her hand, she conjured a floating chalkboard, its surface shimmering with untapped potential. Yannick stepped forward, his mind already alight with the fire of inspiration. As he picked up the chalk, he knew that he was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. But in that moment, faced with the greatest intellectual challenge of his life, Yannick felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. This was what he was born for. And come what may, he would meet his destiny head-on, armed with nothing more than the staggering power of his own mind. The chalk touched the board, and Yannick began to write, the equations flowing from him like water from a spring. And as he lost himself in the pure, exquisite beauty of the mathematics, he knew that his life would never be the same again. The Zendiri conjecture. In the heart of the Escola Galactica, in a room that had witnessed the birth and death of 1,000 theorems, Yannick stood before the shimmering chalkboard, poised on the brink of intellectual history. Around him, the greatest minds of a dozen civilizations watched in breathless anticipation, their eyes fixed on the unassuming figure of the human cleaner. Yannick barely noticed them. His entire being was focused on the task at hand, his mind whirring and spinning as it grappled with the intricacies of the Zendiri conjecture. The equations flowed from his fingertips like music, each symbol and notation a part of a vast, cosmic symphony. To those watching, it was like witnessing the birth of a new form of art. Yannick's movements were fluid and graceful, his chalk dancing across the board in patterns that were at once utterly alien and strangely beautiful. The equations he wrote seemed to take on a life of their own, twisting and morphing into shapes that defied conventional geometry. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of Yannick's relentless assault on the problem. The scholars and professors watched in stunned silence, their own intellects struggling to keep pace with the dizzying leaps and bounds of Yannick's reasoning. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Yannick stepped back from the board, his chest heaving, his brow damp with sweat. The last equation hung in the air, pulsing with a strange, otherworldly energy. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, like a dam bursting, the room erupted into a cacophony of voices. The scholars surged forward, crowding around the board, their eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. Incredible, breathed one, a tall, willowy creature with skin the color of seafoam. He's done it. He's actually solved the conjecture. Impossible, snapped another, a squat, heavily muscled being with a face like a clenched fist. It must be a trick. No mere human could have done this. But even as the words left its mouth, the being knew they were hollow. The proof was there, etched in glowing lines of chalk, irrefutable and undeniable. In the midst of the chaos, Dean Vesta stood motionless, her eyes fixed. Echoes and whispers. In the weeks that followed his fateful solving of the Zandiri conjecture, Yenek's life underwent a transformation so profound it was almost dizzying. Gone were the gray-blue overalls of a janitor, replaced by the flowing robes of an Escola professor. Gone too were the long hours spent pushing a mop and bucket, now filled instead with lectures, research, and the heady rush of intellectual discourse. At first, Yenek reveled in his new status. To be able to stretch his mental wings, to dive into the vast oceans of knowledge without restriction or restraint, it was like taking a breath of pure, sweet air after a lifetime of stifling confinement. He threw himself into his work with a passion that bordered on obsession, his mind leaping and bounding from one breakthrough to the next. But even as he soared to new heights of academic brilliance, Yenek could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. He would catch glimpses of his colleagues whispering in the halls, their eyes following him with a mixture of awe and resentment. He heard the rumors that swirled around him, whispers of the human upstart, the janitor who had dared to outshine his betters. At first, Yenek tried to ignore the whispers, to focus on his work and let his achievements speak for themselves. But as the weeks turned into months, he found himself growing increasingly isolated, cut off from the camaraderie and collegiality that was the lifeblood of the Escola. It was as if, in solving the conjecture, he had crossed some invisible line, stepped into a realm where he was no longer quite human, no longer quite one of them. He was a marvel, a prodigy, a walking, talking embodiment of the impossible. And in the eyes of his colleagues, that made him something to be feared, even reviled. Yenek might have been content to endure their hostility, to wrap himself in the mantle of his own brilliance and let the world fall away. But even as he struggled to find his place in this strange new landscape, he could not shake the feeling that something was amiss, that there were currents moving beneath the surface of the Escola that he did not yet understand. It started with small things, whispered conversations that would fall silent as he approached, data files that would mysteriously vanish from his terminal, experiments that would fail in ways that defied explanation. At first, Yenek chalked it up to coincidence, or perhaps to the petty jealousies of his colleagues. But as the incidents mounted, he could no longer ignore the pattern that was emerging. Someone, or something, was working against him, trying to undermine his research and discredit his findings. The truth, when it finally came, was more shocking than Yenek could have ever imagined. It came to him in the form of a message, delivered by an anonymous source through channels so secure that even the Escola's vaunted cyber defenses could not trace them. The message was brief, but its contents were enough to send a chill down Yenek's spine. It spoke of a secret society, a cabal of the galaxy's most powerful and influential figures, who had been manipulating the course of history for centuries. A group known only as the Imperium. According to the message, the Imperium had been watching Yenek for a long time, ever since he had first arrived at the Escola. They had known of his genius, had seen in him a potential threat to their carefully laid plans. And now, with his solving of the Zandiri conjecture, he had proven himself to be more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The conjecture, it seemed, was more than just a mathematical puzzle. It was a key, a cipher that unlocked the secrets of the universe itself. Secrets that the Imperium would stop at nothing to control. Yenek sat back in his chair, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just learned. He had thought that in coming to the Escola, he had found a sanctuary, a place where he could finally be free to be himself. But now, he realized, he had only traded one prison for another. And this time, the bars were not of his own making, but of a conspiracy so vast and so insidious that it made his own brilliant mind seem like a mere candle flame in comparison. Yenek knew that he had a choice to make. He could run, try to disappear into the vastness of the galaxy and hope that the Imperium would not find him. Or he could stand and fight, use his genius as a weapon against those who sought to control him. In the end, there was really no choice at all. Yenek was not a man to run from a challenge, no matter how daunting. He had not come this far, had not sacrificed so much, only to fade away into obscurity. No, he would meet this threat head-on, armed with nothing more than the unparalleled power of his own intellect. He would unravel the secrets of the Imperium, expose their lies and machinations for all the galaxy to see. And in doing so, he would fulfill the true potential of his genius, not as a mere solver of puzzles, but as a beacon of truth and freedom in a galaxy shrouded in darkness. The path ahead would be dangerous, perhaps even deadly. But Yannick had never been one to shy away from danger. With a grim smile, he turned back to his terminal, his fingers already flying over the keys. He had work to do, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. The Imperium had no idea what they were up against. But they were about to find out, in ways they could never imagine. For Yannick, the unassuming cleaner with the IQ of 375, was on the case. And he would not rest until the truth was revealed, no matter the cost. A battle of wits. In a darkened room deep within the heart of the Escola Galactica, Yannick sat hunched over his terminal, his eyes locked on the scrolling lines of code that danced across the screen. For days now, he had been working feverishly, his brilliant mind pushing itself to the very limits of endurance as he sought to unravel the tangled web of the Imperium's machinations. It had not been easy. The Imperium's cyber defenses were formidable, their encryption algorithms so complex that even the most advanced AI systems would have taken years to crack them. But Yannick was not like other men. His mind worked on a different level, seeing patterns and connections where others saw only chaos. Bit by bit, byte by byte, he had chipped away at the Imperium's secrets, peeling back layer after layer of obfuscation and misdirection. And now, after countless sleepless nights and countless pots of strong, black coffee, he was finally ready to make his move. With a final tap of his fingers, Yannick sat back, a grim smile of satisfaction playing across his lips. The program was ready, a masterpiece of coding that would penetrate the very heart of the Imperium's network and lay bare their darkest secrets for all the galaxy to see. But even as he savored his triumph, Yannick knew that the true battle was yet to come. The Imperium would not take this lying down. They would come for him, with all the vast resources and ruthless cunning at their disposal. He had to be ready. And so, with a heavy heart, Yannick set his plan into motion. It began with a message, a carefully crafted communiqué that Yannick sent out across the Escola's network, seemingly by accident. The message appeared to be a fragment of his research, a tantalizing glimpse of the groundbreaking discoveries he had made in the weeks since solving the Zendiri conjecture. As Yannick had anticipated, the message did not go unnoticed. Within hours, the Escola was buzzing with excitement, scholars and students alike clamoring to learn more about this latest breakthrough. And then, just as the frenzy reached its peak, Yannick made his move. In a flash, he was gone, vanishing from the Escola without a trace. His quarters were empty, his terminal wiped clean. It was as if he had never existed. Panic gripped the Escola. Had Yannick been kidnapped? Had he defected to some rival institution? The theories flew fast and furious, each more outlandish than the last. Only Dean Vesta seemed to keep her head, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as she studied the last known footage of Yannick, caught by the Escola's ubiquitous surveillance cameras. There was something about the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, that made her wonder. Could it be that Yannick had planned this all along? That his disappearance was not a sign of defeat, but of some deeper, more intricate strategy? She did not have long to ponder the question. For even as the Escola descended into chaos, a new threat was emerging, one that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy itself. It started with a series of coordinated attacks, striking at the heart of the Imperium's power structure. Financial markets collapsed, governments toppled, entire planets were plunged into darkness as their power grids failed. And at the center of it all, a ghostly figure haunting the edges of the Imperium's fraying web, was Yannick. He had not vanished at all, it seemed, but had merely gone to ground, marshalling his forces for the final confrontation. For months, the battle raged across the stars, a silent war fought not with ships and soldiers, but with bits and bytes, with algorithms and equations. Yannick was everywhere and nowhere, his genius always one step ahead of the Imperium's desperate countermeasures. And then, just when it seemed that the Imperium's defeat was all but certain, they played their final card. In a last-ditch effort to save themselves, they released a virus, a malevolent code that swept across the galaxy like a plague, infecting every system it touched. The virus was unlike anything Yannick had ever encountered, a twisted masterpiece of destruction that seemed to anticipate his every move, countering his strategies almost before he could devise them. For the first time in his life, Yannick felt the cold grip of fear, the realization that he might have finally met his match. The virus was relentless, implacable, a manifestation of the Imperium's vast resources and ruthless will. But even as despair threatened to engulf him, Yannick refused to give in. He had not come this far, had not sacrificed so much, only to be defeated at the final hurdle. And so, with a final, desperate effort, he unleashed his own creation, a counter-virus born of his unparalleled genius, a shining lance of pure, incorruptible code that pierced the heart of the Imperium's malevolent AI. It was a battle unlike any the galaxy had ever seen, a clash of titans fought on a canvas of pure mathematics. For a breathless moment, the outcome hung in the balance, the fate of billions resting on the outcome of this ethereal duel. And then, with a final